Well, welcome back to our Far Middle podcast. This is episode number 5, and I am Nick DeJulius. By the way, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can. At Nick DeJulius is my tag, NickDeiuliis. Please do so if you're interested. And today, in this installment of our podcast, we're going to be talking about academia. And academia is both a big issue as well as a personal one for me. Big issue, of course, because it just plays a crucial role in society, front and center in so many different ways. So getting academia's focus in the right direction is crucial if we want to get to where we want to be as a society. And if it's on the wrong track, that's going to be a problem. Also personal, because I've always, considered myself quite the lifelong learner. I've always been interested in academics and pursuing different degrees and attending college. If I had unlimited time, I'd be one of those individuals that wouldn't be on the golf course or sitting on the beach. I would probably be in a classroom pursuing some other avenue or degree where I've got these varied interests. So it's played a really important role in my life and a good one. And I want to make sure I've got a vested interest, I suppose, in making sure that academia is on the right track, so to speak, and not the wrong one. So we're going to talk about some of the looming issues and, frankly, the crisis that is facing academia today and where it's coming from and how it manifests itself and what we might do about it. Concern about where academia is at and where it's heading, it's nothing new. You had William F. Buckley years ago who put out a pretty famous and popular quote where he said, "I should sooner live in a society governed by the first 2,000 names in the Boston telephone directory than in a society governed by the first 2,000 faculty members of Harvard." So there you go with a quote from a thought leader that was contrasting the common man, so to speak, or common individual versus a faculty member at our most elite university in the land. You take a look at some of the mottos that are out there with the big name, famous universities within our borders. You've got Harvard, of course, where their motto is Truth Veritas. Yale, I guess they had a one-up Harvard, so they went with light and truth. Columbia has In Thy Light Shall We See Light. And the California Institute of Technology, if you go out to the West Coast, their motto is "The truth shall make you free." Now, what they all have in common, of course, is this theme of truth, which we like to associate with academia, the seeker of truth and the pursuit of knowledge to come to a truth-based view or a truth-based conclusion. If you even go to areas like Wikipedia and you take a look at how Wikipedia defines academic integrity, and it defines it as the moral code or ethical policy of academia. This includes values such as avoidance of cheating or plagiarism, maintenance of academic standards, honesty and rigor in research, and academic publishing. So if you think about that definition, well, what are the key words that pop out at you? They're very similar to what we saw in the mottos that we just discussed with these different elite universities. So you see words like standards, honesty, and rigor. Those are the types of words and descriptors that anybody, including myself and yourself, would want to be associated with. So you've got this image and these aspirations that make quite a bit of sense. And they're types of aspirations and image that you would want to see within academic institutions. But the reality, frankly, is quite different. The reality is that academia has been greatly fossilized. It's completely out of touch with what its role and responsibility and, frankly, its mission is within society. So just think about some of the realities, right? We've had this view for a long time, because it was true largely, that the student could embark upon a college education and work his or her way through school and basically cover tuition, room and board, and with some maybe assistance from family along with some student loans, and then working some summer jobs, you could basically work your way through college. That today is largely a fiction. Now, why is it a fiction? Because tuition and all these other costs associated with a college degree have, to say they've skyrocketed is an understatement. They've exponentially exploded would be a more apt descriptor. And the price points now that you see with a college degree, from what you would consider to be public state type institutions and universities to the most elite universities, or it's almost impossible in many of the degree programs to pay your way through college when you look at the math of it, and B, get an acceptable rate of return on the investment that you made, whether it's through loans or family putting up life savings to post to cover tuition. So what that means is college is basically broken down into one of two camps. You can go pursue a very expensive degree in an endeavor with a job skill set when you exit that will have a high enough salary that would justify the rate of return. And those types of programs and degrees are fewer and fewer as the costs of college continue to rise. So it's not the majority of degrees that are offered by universities. It's in the minority. Or you're faced with a situation where you used to want to go to college to pursue degrees for basically the sake of inquiry and the sake of knowledge, the pursuit of knowledge. That is no longer a feasible solution. We basically have priced that solution, or that option maybe is a better description of it. That option is gone. It's off the table because colleges have priced themselves right past it. You've got also the resistance to change that you see in academia. What I mean by that is what used to be in demand with respect to degree programs, that changes. Technology changes, economies change, but universities and academia do not change along with the reality. So in some liberal arts programs, you've got actually more faculty than students, which shows you if you don't change resources, staffing, bricks and mortar, budgets, everything in between, when there's a declining demand for that type of a degree or program in society, then you get to these strange outcomes where literally more faculty than students, because academia just is unwilling and unable to adapt and evolve. A root cause of why we're seeing this dichotomy between the image and the reality within academia is academia itself. It is frankly in many ways in revolt and resisting what its original mission and what society's expectations are with respect to it. If you think about a public institution, it's very common where you see the public funding them, the taxpayer or the citizen funding them, in return for providing a service that the public is requesting. So you see that with police departments, fire departments, public schools with primary and high schools, our court system, and on it goes. Now, sometimes those public institutions do a fine job of meeting what the citizens and taxpayers are asking of it, and sometimes they fall off the path, right? We've seen that recently in the case of police departments in cities and in certain instances. So it's not always going to be perfect, but there is this social contract where I will pay for this service. In return, you provide that service. That's always worked with respect to our public institutions. Academia has taken that original social construct and contract and basically has breached it. And it's willingly breached it in quite an arrogant manner. So what is happening now is that you've got academia saying that we'll take your money, parent, we'll take your money, student, we'll take your money, society, but we're going to do with it not what you want. We're going to do with it what we want to do. And that runs from everything with respect to the curriculum that is going to be presented over the 4 years or so of the journey academically, to how it's setting about its budgeting, to how it views itself and its role within wider society. So it's a very far-ranging arrogance that academia is applying in breach of what I call this social contract that has been in place for quite some time. Now, the answer, of course, is one of two things. The answer should be either A, demand reform. So, okay, academia, you're going to get back into compliance with this social contract. And if you don't, then option B is we stop sending our money and spending our money with respect to that endeavor. That could be tax dollars. That could be enrollment via tuition dollars, or a combination of the two. So in many ways, we sort of hold the purse strings and the answers to how you get the reform within academia. But on the flip side, just keep in mind, this is going to be an uphill battle because as we're going to see now in the next couple of minutes, the situation with academia has gone far past where you'd want it to be. And there are very entrenched positions and cultures that are going to need a bit of a turnaround. A big driver of where academia is at and where it's going is a variation of the iron triangle that we spoke about in a prior podcast, where in government, the iron triangle was the lobbyist and the bureaucrat and the politician all working in concert sometimes against the interests of the rest of us. Here, the variation of the iron triangle in academia has in its three corners three terms that I've described in the book, The Leech, on the chapter in academia. One corner, you've got the crazed professor. The other corner, you've got the shatterable student. And then in the third corner, you've got the administrative staff, the administration, not the faculty, but the administration of the university. And although in the case of the crazed professor and the shatterable student, that's a small percentage of the total student body and the total faculty count, they just hold a tremendously outsized influence on what happens strategically, culturally within academia. And what do you see there? Well, you see that alliance, that iron triangle in academia, creating a conformity to a culture that is frankly out of alignment with the rest of society. The rest of society, as we've seen in the past two presidential elections, you've got people with views on the left, people with views on the right, people who are D's, people who are R's, and maybe those that are a mix of both. I said in a prior podcast, myself as an example, I consider myself socially to be quite liberal, but fiscally to be quite conservative. And if anything, I'm probably best described as a libertarian, neither a Democrat nor a Republican. But society out there in our United States of America is widely spread, some call divided, but nevertheless spread across that spectrum. Not within academia. Within academia, it is very uniform. And the entire system, in many ways, is using or viewing education as a means in which to advance a form of ideology or thought that accords with certain political viewpoints. So it's very much a non-diverse sort of, from a thought perspective, a non-diverse way of thinking of things politically, ideologically, and philosophically. You look at academia and we think of it as a nonprofit and not as a company or profit-driven entity. But if it were a company, what you see culturally with academia might be best described as company policy. This is the company policy. This is the company line. And if you are working within or you have a career within the company, you're going to toe the line or else. So it's interesting to see that pervasive and extent of the pervasiveness throughout academia. You also see universities today presiding over almost a reversion, de-evolution when it comes to civics. It's almost like we're creating civic illiteracy in many ways by design. And that civic illiteracy can be very beneficial to that iron triangle, particularly to the administrative staff, to the crazed professors and the shatterable students, where as illiteracy civically increases, then the ability to exert your influence and your way of thinking, that goes up as well. Now, what happens when you pursue this type of approach over years and years is that it accumulates in statistics. You see it everywhere. And we can look at it from a conservative, liberal perspective, but that's probably the best way. There are other ways you could assess this, and you'd see the same thing where academia is no longer sort of the marketplace of ideas. The National Association of Scholars, I saw a report recently there where they had dozens and dozens of incidents that they recorded where professors were disciplined or fired for what? For basically protected speech, constitutionally protected speech. That's a 500% increase from the prior year. So that's disturbing. I saw another statistic that was really intriguing to me. 70%, 7 in 10 of conservative academics admitted that they self-censor in their teachings or research or academic discussions. Again, the marketplace of ideas has become a myth or a fiction because of what has been occurring. And I saw another statistic that was sort of intriguing. Britain, right, but very similar to what's going on in the United States. So Britain voted to exit the EU. Brexit passed. Yet in British academia, 1 in 3 academics admitted they wouldn't hire a Brexit supporter, which to me is really interesting and somewhat frightening. And then I also saw another statistic. I think it was put out in a book by a couple of political scientists. I think the book was Passing on the Right. That was the title of it. But they quoted that 10% of social science faculty members identified as conservative. So, whether you're conservative or liberal, or in my case, libertarian, or in my case, right, conservative in some instances like fiscal arenas, but liberal in others like social, really doesn't matter. What you want to see from academic institutions is a diversity of thought and a marketplace of ideas, and we have anything but that. When you really see that outside of academia manifest is also intriguing to me. I saw recently, I'm not sure if you picked this up or not, but the recent meeting between China and the United States. We had the Chinese Communist Party Foreign Affairs Chief meeting with our Secretary of State Blinken. And the Chinese Communist Party Foreign Affairs Chief put on a speech that basically took the United States and America to task. All the evils that we do and all the bad that we represent for the globe, point by point. If you looked at those bullet points that the Chinese Communist Party Foreign Affairs Chief laid out, it's almost bullet for bullet, word for word, a repeat of what you hear coming from academia today within the United States. And that to me was both fascinating and terrifying. So in the one corner of this iron triangle with the crazed professor, when you've got this trend through the years that have accumulated just a massively skewed political and ideological leaning across faculty, particularly in social sciences, liberal arts areas, humanities, that has the repercussion where an individual faculty member or a small handful of professors can just wreak havoc on the entire system, especially a system in academia, remember, that is really consensus-based. I mean, a lot of the decision-making, a lot of the way that academia goes about evolving and setting strategy is consensus-driven. And that means that an outlier or an extreme outlier, a small handful of those, can just have an outsized amount of influence. So it's not surprising, I think, to see how the inability to create a marketplace of ideas and the lack of diversity of thought and the suppression of free speech within the faculty ranks through the years has not just skewed the data to the extent that we've seen, but has also created now the culture where a small number of the most radical or forest left-leaning can just have a complete outsized influence on the entire system to the point where it hijacks it. The second corner of that iron triangle, sitting across from the crazed professor, is the shatterable student. Now, like the crazed professor, the shatterable student is a small percentage of the total student body. But like the crazed professor, it also enjoys, or he or she also enjoys, outsized influence on what is going on with respect to the campus culture. And there's a couple root causes for that. One root cause you will pick up the moment you step foot on campus for a college tour. I don't know if you've been through those with yourself or kids recently, but it's really fascinating. Every tour, of course, is different based on the institution that you're visiting. But when you go on these campus tours with prospective college students in high school, you see some similarities everywhere you go. I mean, one thing that you see is the touting of the food selections in the dining halls and how they're organic. You hear all this talk about sustainability and how green the campus is. And livable the campus is. You tour or see the dorm facilities, and in many instances, not all of them, but in a lot of them, you're just shocked at how nice they are. In fact, in some instances, or in many instances, they're better and nicer than what the kid has at home with their own room. And you hear about clubs and affiliations and all the other things that go along with it. So you're immediately hit with the view that the campus and all of the different facets of it are there to meet the beck and call of the student and the student's needs. Another root cause of all this, frankly, is just the culture of kids growing up today before they even get to college. And if you think about just how kids are segmented and raised today, and in some instances coddled, but everything is very discreet and scheduled and compartmentalized, when you experience nothing but that, and some might call that life in a bubble, and then you get to college, you're going to expect and frankly demand an environment that's similar to that. And some of those, and a small percentage of those that fall into the shatterable student category, they may demand a set of circumstances and an environment that the rest of us would laugh at and the rest of their student body would laugh at. But nevertheless, there you are. What's really sad about this is if you take it to its end result, the whole idea of what a student went into college as and what they came out as has fundamentally changed. So it wasn't that long ago where we thought of college a place sort of where the student went in naive, a little soft, narrow-minded or thinking because they weren't exposed to a lot of different viewpoints and experiences. And then through those 4 years, right, they were going to go through a well-rounded and focused education. They were going to come out ready for battle in the economy, in the real world. They're going to have some very discrete and valuable skill sets that they're armed with. And basically at college, you got thrown into the fire. And for the first time in your life, you had to produce, you had to adapt, you had to evolve. And that was the learning process. And you learned how to think, right? You came out with a new skill set called learning how to think. But what we got today is very different, unfortunately. And today, college is in many ways designed to produce the exact opposite type of attributes. Students today, they often exit more narrower-minded than when they went in. They're somewhat ignorant and clueless as to how the real world works because the college campus has been completely insulated and rejects anything that seems to be affiliated with the real world. And there's a bit of a sense of entitlement that those 4 years have calcified, have strengthened over the time that the student has been in college, not eroded it away and made it more flexible, made the student more open-minded. Now, this culture of academia, when it forges the shatterable student into what he or she becomes, it also results in some other trends that frankly are disturbing. And one area in particular is with student learning disability. This is an area that I'm very passionate about. My family and extended family has dealt with physical disability, mental disability, and learning disability through the years. So I've seen it front and center. And I think one of the most heinous things that a person can do would be to claim a disability where none exists to get an edge or to get an advantage. If you look at the data with higher education, it's really interesting to see what's going on there when it comes to student learning disability. Today, almost 1 in 4 students, depending on the college that you look at, many of them elite colleges, and over 2 million college students nationwide are considered disabled. And those rates are skyrocketing when you compare them to just a couple of short years prior, and they're going to continue to rise. I mean, it's almost a given that they will continue to rise. So you can see an individual university or college is posting a 20 to 25% disability rate for students in, say, 2018 or 2019. I haven't seen data recently because of COVID. I'm sure, again, it's gone up. But if you just look at where it was at a few short years prior to that, 5 years prior to that, 4 years prior to that, they were low single digits. So in many instances at colleges and universities, these disability rates have gone from, say, 5%, 5-6 years ago, up to 20+%, 25% today, and climbing, continuing to climb. Now, what's going on here, of course, is that a lot of these disabilities that are relating to learning issues, they're very challenging to assess. So if you're looking at depression or anxiety or attention deficit or stress in general, it's not clear-cut decision-making tree analysis that you would use for, say, a physical ailment that is bothering you, that a doctor or a physician would run you through to try to diagnose what's going on. Here it's very subjective. And I'm not a physician by any stretch of the imagination, but if you look at some of the symptoms or characterizations that, say, psychiatrists are instructed to assess for some of these learning disabilities, they're very general, very vague, and very difficult to quantify. They're very qualitative. So that lends itself to a lot of interpretation. And if you couple that with some of the results of being tagged learning disabled or disabled in general on campus, you can start to see where the problem comes from. Because if you are, say, learning disabled or tagged as such on campus, in many instances, what do you get? What happens? Well, you get more time for exams. You get to take exams in an isolated environment. You don't have to take it with the rest of the class. You get to walk around in classes if you don't want to sit still. You get to bring comfort animals to class in some instances. So there's a whole host of advantages that you get if you are indeed deemed to be disabled or learning disabled. And that edge in a competitive academic environment, whether it's with grades or GPA or job prospects, you can see where this goes. And where it goes is you've got maybe a very small percentage of students that are are willing to go that route to get the edge. And then there's students that may be sitting on the fence in this competitive environment that see those others getting the edge, and then they feel that they're justified in going after the edge, and so on. And what happens tragically is you've got the legitimately disabled student, whether it's physical or learning, that's an insult to. You've got the student that didn't game the system for the edge that is now increasingly competing in an unfair environment. That's not right. And you've got the overall sort of societal view of disability. I feel that it's changed, it's evolved in not a good way. The more focused we are on disability and making the accommodations that we need to for the legitimately disabled, the better off we're going to be. Now, the supposed root causes of learning disabilities like stress, they are also pointed to and used as justification for the higher level of cheating that we've seen across academia by students recently, particularly in the COVID area with remote learning. So you see these issues coming together in the COVID area, right? You've got on one hand this hypersensitivity, where even though it's been shown with data and science that younger individuals are less susceptible to the ravages of the pandemic. We completely shut down all of the college campuses and universities for extended terms and periods of time, went remote. The remote situation then lent itself to a whole host of new ways of basically cheating on exams and papers, from online auctioning of papers that were already written to the gaming of the system with online examinations. And then the pointing of the root cause of that was, well, the stress that's caused by the pandemic and the shutdown of the colleges that put the students under a situation where they basically broke from the stress and made the decision to cheat on the academic exam or paper. So you see this non-virtuous cycle or circle, so to speak, where one builds on the other. And interestingly, we talked about in that iron triangle the crazed professor and the shatterable student, but really the most crucial corner of the triangle is the administrative staff or the administration of the university itself. That is really the wellspring where a lot of these issues that we just discussed with the professors and with the students spring from. Look, the administration, it is the true power base and the puppet master of this dynamic that we've just discussed. Administrator on a university campus, it's the same, it's code for bureaucrat, just like we've talked about when it comes to bureaucracy, say in government. But here, the administrator on campus, it controls all the students, not just the shatterable students, all students. And it controls that student journey from the moment they step foot on campus for a tour, through the admissions process, obviously through their 4 years on campus, and until they receive their diploma on stage at a graduation. It controls every faculty member, every professor, not just the crazed professor. And that's true from when they become graduate assistants through as associate professors to tenured professors to retirement. So the administration, it is, as I said, the puppet master that's got effectively complete control of both students and faculty. And this is also the biggest reason, singularly, why you've seen the explosion, as I called it earlier, the exponential explosion in tuition and the cost of higher education through the years. The rate of inflation when it comes to higher education outstrips anything that we've seen. Healthcare, consumers, CPI, energy prices, anything you can imagine. And the administration is the singular biggest contributor to that blowout rate of tuition and basically the shattering of any conceivable rate of return for a lot of degreed programs that you have out there across colleges and universities today. The administration on a campus, it is a big believer in never letting a good crisis go to waste, even a crisis that you can manufacture, sometimes where no real crisis exists. Many examples of this, but let's just hit on a few of them. Safe spaces. This idea of safe spaces where the university and the administration of the university creates a location wherein students can go or faculty can go and wherein certain ideas are not welcome. that is the antithesis of the free market or the marketplace of ideas and or free speech as well. So safe spaces have to be administered. Safe spaces have to be set up. The sort of guidelines and procedures of the safe spaces, all of that, of course, would be done by the administration, which requires people in administration to perform those functions. Overall, beyond safe spaces, you've got very much sort of what I would reference as a snitch culture in campuses today, where you're encouraged, whether faculty, students, et cetera, to basically snitch on others because of what they say or what they believe, whether they're saying that or expressing that in a classroom or in a social setting or in the dining hall. It really doesn't matter. When you look at these areas under snitch culture of microaggressions and these bias response teams and bias reporting systems for the microaggressions, you almost get the feel that this is more authoritative police state with surveillance and reporting mechanisms than a marketplace of ideas when it comes to a institution of higher learning. But yet again, all those rules, all those regulations, procedures, adjudication of issues, when problems pop up, that requires an administration to preside over, which of course increases its influence, its budget, and its staffing. Whenever you have different types of speakers, and here I'm talking about controversial speakers, which might mean non-leftist speakers, right? It could be conservative speakers or right-of-center speakers on campus to present or lecture on a topic. You've got a whole series of events that are then typically precipitated from handling protests and debates about whether you're going to disinvite the speaker or not. But also you see what I call triage events that occur either in conjunction with the lecture that's being held or afterward for those that are bothered by the viewpoints or the topics or that need assistance or help. Once again, all that triaging and how you set those up and how they're administered and how they are presided over require a tremendous amount of growing administrative staff to look over. We talked about disability and student learning disability and how that is exploding in rate across campuses, diagnosing that, dealing with that, the special rules or edge that a student gets if it has or has been tagged as learning disabled, if he or she has done so. Then again, those things need to be managed by an administration. And you see it, the power of the administration perhaps most prominently when it comes to admissions. Today, colleges are big supporters of what they call holistic admissions. Now, whenever I hear holistic, that's a term that I use quite a bit. I'm as guilty as the next person of it. But sometimes we misapply that word. It sounds good, but it can be misapplied because, and oftentimes it's too vague of a definition. So what does holistic admissions mean? Well, I looked it up. You've got the Association of Public and Land Grant Universities. And that association of the public and land grant universities, it defines holistic admissions as assessing an applicant's unique experiences alongside traditional measures of academic readiness. Well, you can think about that definition and then see how much flexibility and discretion it gives the administration through the admissions process to exert influence and outcomes. Now, sometimes that can be used, holistic admissions, and getting away from things like SAT scores and GPA or grade point averages, and instead going to holistics. That can help set targeted diversity goals or objectives with the administration. Interestingly, we've been seeing now more and more often where the desire to increase the representation of one demographic is coming at the expense of another demographic. In some instances, that demographic that's paying the price under holistic admissions is another minority demographic, in this case, Asian Americans. We'll talk about that on an upcoming podcast when we discuss STEM and what's going on with STEM education. But you also, I think, see this in a big way where the administration benefits with holistic admissions when it just comes to the overall process. If you don't require something like standardized SAT or ACT scores, and you go to holistic, then that does a couple of things that are beneficial to the administration. First, it will encourage a much greater number of students to apply to elite universities. So let's say that I'm interested in going to Harvard, but I did not do well on my SAT score. If I do not need to report the SAT score. If it's optional or it's not even going to be considered, then I'm much more likely to apply to Harvard. So applicant volume for these universities goes way up, which means, again, you need more staff on the administration side, which presides over admissions. It's not faculty. People are sometimes surprised to realize that faculty really do not play a role in admissions. It's all administration in a university that presides over admissions. So if applicant volume goes up, you need more administrators. Also, subjectivity goes up. So if you don't have SAT scores or ACT scores and you don't have GPAs, you're free as an administrator to use whatever set of criteria you desire to select your admissions class on a year in and year out basis. And exclusivity goes up. If you're that university and your applicant pool went from X to 2X or 3X because prospective students are more encouraged to apply, but you're still taking effectively the same number of students as admitted students for each year, then your exclusivity, your percent admitted rate goes way down. That creates an aura of exclusivity. And again, who benefited? The university, the administration sitting over it. Now, who gets harmed in all of this? Of course, the student that's admitted, the student that filed for admission and was rejected, and anything that's a stakeholder that is somehow supporting and paying for all of this, whether it's the student with tuition, the family of the student paying for tuition, taxpayers through student loans and the subsidization of higher education through tax dollars, all of the above. Unfortunately, the fact of the matter is that today the number one job of the administrative bureaucracy on a campus is to make sure it can hire more people into the administrative bureaucracy on the campus. This uses to its benefit the crazed professors that we spoke about. It uses to its benefit the shatterable students that we've discussed. It is, again, the puppet master that really controls the true power base on campus today. Another interesting juxtaposition that you see here is when you look at very authoritative regimes or countries that are out there. I use the example in the book of China and Turkey in particular, and how they go about managing their higher education and their educational system in general, and some of the really heavy-handed tactics that they use. Boy, it feels and sounds an awful lot like what's going on, unfortunately, within the American higher education system. Now, speaking of government and governments, it's very obvious today that the U.S. federal government and the higher education system in America are closely coordinated and closely cooperate with one another. It's a mutually beneficial relationship. On one hand, you've got the college that is indoctrinating students as they enter the real world to think a certain way, and that certain way views big government in a very favorable light. And then government returns the favor. Now, how do they do that? Government can do that one of two ways. One is through handing down regulations and rules and laws that allow the university administration to grow its power and its size and its impact over its stakeholder base. A great example of this is with Title IX. Title IX, I'm not sure if you're familiar with it or not, but it deals with alleged campus sexual misconduct, a very serious matter, not to be taken lightly by any stretch of the imagination. What's interesting about Title IX guidance given by the government to universities is that universities can apply discretion on evidence standards. They can apply a lower than a beyond a reasonable doubt standard that you would see in criminal court, and can in fact apply a preponderance of the evidence standard. Thinking of preponderance of the evidence, that standard requires practically, way of thinking of it would be a 50.01% likelihood of guilt. That's all you need to show, much easier than beyond a reasonable doubt. Now, this lower evidence standard for alleged campus sexual misconduct, it has big-time implications, as you can imagine, for faculty, students, the accused, et cetera, across a whole range of instances and examples. And many of those examples are discussed in the book, in the chapter on academia. But what's really interesting is who benefits in the end by those flexible standards of evidence that can be applied. And in the end, the primary beneficiary is the administration of the college or university. Why is that? Well, if you lower evidence standards than you would see in society outside of the quad walls, that allows for more cases to be brought. More cases need to be administered. More cases need to be managed. They need to be adjudicated. That again helps the budget, the staffing, and the size of the administration within a college. You also have the ability with lower evidence standards to apply much wider discretion on how you're judging these cases on a individual by individual basis. And then you look at the bureaucracy that it creates under Title IX. You've got courts and chambers. You look at processes that typically will include investigations and investigators, judging panels, open sessions, closed sessions, all kinds of different witness testimony needs to be taken, of course. And then all the follow-on effects of whatever the judgment or finding is throughout the career of, say, the professor or faculty member or the student. All that support from government is occurring via, as I said, rules and regulations and laws to boost the administration of higher education. You've also got the assistance, the second major route via the federal government, which is just financial. It's just straight up dollars and cents, and the numbers are quite large. We, at first under the Obama administration, heard that the federal government was going to take on a $1+ trillion. At the time, I think it was $1.4 trillion student loan portfolio. The covered loans made to over 40 million students of some shape or form, or their families. Now that portfolio has grown to about $1.6 trillion. And at the time when that initial commitment was made by the government, the education department had the audacity, frankly, to claim with a straight face that as taxpayers, we'd be making a return on the portfolio, because when you looked at the interest payments and the principal repayments, they would more than cover the expenses and the upfront investment. So this was going to be a good investment for taxpayers. Then each year, the education department would publish a financial report that would include expectations on how this portfolio was performing, basically whether we were in the money or more in the money, less in the money, or how it was looking from a return perspective. When you go to 2015, after this commitment was made, the government view was billions of dollars of surplus for taxpayers, so all was well. Then that shifted from a surplus to about an $8 billion shortfall in 2016, the next year. Then that went to a $36 billion shortfall in 17, the following year. And all of this was basically buried. Good luck trying to find that in these reports from the education department, because they were buried in footnotes and in the details of the report. If you started to dig a little deeper, you basically came to the conclusion that the government was really applying some misleading and some extremely aggressive assumptions that would help overstate a surplus or understate a deficit that the student loan portfolio was presenting. So despite these projections, what happened? Well, default rates were being lowballed, even though we had, I think at the time, 5 million borrowers that were being in default of payments or failing to make payments for at least a year. And you had a whole host of other data points that were basically flying right in the face and contradicting the assumptions that the education department was making when projecting budget surpluses or shortfalls. The GAO and the education department now estimates a $74 billion subsidy cost for just income-driven repayment plans alone. That's just a piece of the portfolio. And that is a far greater number than what was prior estimated. The CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, it's an even bleaker picture. They are estimating that we're going to be on the hook as taxpayers for over $200 billion in student loan forgiveness, and that's under the income-driven repayment program, and that's over the next 10 years. So again, it's just a subset of the portfolio and just for the next 10 years. And then at the end of 2020, the Education Department, along with its consultants, came out and now estimated that taxpayer losses under this student loan portfolio that the federal government holds, it's going to exceed $400 billion. So quite the change from the surplus or the return that was promised when the government first undertook the student loan portfolio. And again, who are the beneficiaries of this? Well, certainly it's not the taxpayer, but in the end, it is most definitely going to be the higher education system and the administration within higher education that basically were the ones that took all this money in the form of tuition and the trillions of dollars through the years, put students through 4 years or whatever the extent of time was for education, so to speak, and then basically put them into the workforce without the skill sets that were demanded in the economy Thus, the students weren't able to make the payments or repayments on their loans. So the beneficiaries here are the ones that actually created the crisis to begin with, yet they're absolved from any accountability with respect to addressing it. Wrapping up this session, an installment of our Far Middle podcast, looking at academia. It's really an interesting and a depressing situation from my perspective, again, being a lifelong fan of academia and trying to be a lifelong learner. President Roosevelt, Franklin Roosevelt, and I said on an earlier podcast, wasn't a big fan of FDR, but I did say he had a way with words, right? Well, he said back in his 1941 State of the Union address, he spoke of 4 essential human freedoms. He talked about freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Today, unfortunately, colleges are denying students all 4 of these freedoms that Roosevelt, that FDR spoke about. Speech isn't free, it's censored on campuses. Religion isn't free because campus leftists are restricting it. Students, they're going to want and need skill sets, but colleges deny them those skill sets. And fear suppresses freedom, not the other way around. Another president of ours, this was just after World War II, before he became president, General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower. He, many don't know this, but he served as president of Colombia after World War II. And he had a good tagline at one point where he was talking about how free thought and open debate are the lifeblood of a great university. And he vowed that under his tenure as president of Columbia, there would be no, quote, intellectual iron curtain, end quote, at Columbia. Well, what we've got today and what Ike viewed as a favorable culture at a university, those are in stark contrast with one another. What's also disturbing about this is there's so many losers in this entire situation. You've got students that are graduating college without the necessary skill sets. They're not being armed with the meaningful skill sets that employers and the economy wants to see. They're being burdened with a tremendous amount of debt when it comes to student loan debt. And it's basically creating, from the student perspective, almost a generation zero, where they've got this double whammy to deal with of not having the skill sets that are needed in the workforce, and they're burdened by massive amounts of student debt. Now, the other big stakeholder that loses in this mess, of course, is the taxpayer. We're the ones that are on the hook for what is approaching a $2 trillion student loan portfolio that will be subjected to all kinds of massive defaults, and that will sum in the hundreds of billions of dollars that we'll be on the hook for. Who's the beneficiary of this mess? Of course, it's the entity that caused it all to begin with, which is the higher education system, and particularly the administration within that system. Unfortunately, the United States is a free enterprise, capitalistic society that is burdened with a leftist higher education system. And until the taxpayer and the student and the family of the student and the businesses that are hiring these graduates, until we collectively demand accountability from a broken higher education system, we should not expect accountability to manifest itself anytime soon. In fact, the situation will only worsen. The good news is that this situation is so egregious that more and more people across those stakeholder groups are becoming more and more aware of what the crisis is and are demanding accountability. And I hope that reckoning comes sooner rather than later. I hope you enjoyed this installment of the Far Middle podcast. And until we speak again, stay safe and stay strong.